far southern end of the island of Manhattan to what the seafaring Dutch had called New Amsterdam, but which is now more sterilely christened the Financial District. This lifeless agglomeration of concrete and glass was not at first glance an ideal neighborhood for a writer like me, whose subjects are nature and fishing and seafood. But I liked the fact that just on the other side of the skyscrapers the water lay in three directions. I was intrigued that the place where I now made my home was America's original seaport, the very spot where some of the very first American seafood had been landed. I quickly realized I was deluding myself. For a week I followed the routes that most people traveled in my new neighborhood, up Broadway, past banks and brokerage firms, past the bare asphalt slab called Zuccotti Park. On the site of the New Amsterdam colony, there was now a depressing convergence of fast food franchises and an oddly duplicative march of bad shoe stores. I stared into the empty pit at ground zero and tried uselessly to find some connection to the place, like a mariner throwing out an anchor into muddy bottom. The tines found no purchase. Finally, at the beginning of the second week in my new home, I rose early and set out by bicycle to get a broader feel for this empty-feeling place. Choosing the rising sun as my direction, I turned east against traffic at the street that in New Amsterdam days had been called de Magdapatje, the Maiden's Path, so named because it was the chosen route for Dutch girls bringing their washing down to the East River on laundry days. Today called Maiden Lane, it brought me to Pearl Street, once Perlstraat, an appellation that derives from the time when the road was paved with native oyster shell. As I coasted along Pearl, I skirted over landfill that had long ago buried a swatch of salt marsh known in colonial times as Beekman's Swamp. At Dover Street, I headed east again until I arrived at Water Street. The street once marked the water's edge, but now after landfill had widened the city considerably, Water Street was several blocks from the water. But just past Water, the feel of the neighborhood started to change, and the ghost of a former incarnation started to reveal itself. At the corner of Dover, I came across a red-clapboard building that I later learned was one of the oldest functioning public houses in New York. Beyond this distinctly maritime-looking tavern stood a row of crotchety old buildings, all from the early 1800s. Hazy stenciling could be made out on a few. Joshua Atkins and Company, ship chandlers. Joseph C. LaRocca and Sons, shellfish and seafood. From Dover, I went east to Front Street and then tacked south to Peck Slip, a grand plaza in disrepair that petered away and dumped me out onto South Street. There before me stood a metal warehouse built during the Great Depression. Weeping with water stains, it bore a straightforward working person's declaration of purpose on its facade. Fulton Fish Market, City of New York, Department of Markets. I had happened upon what had been the most storied and voluminous seafood market in the world, and nobody seemed to care that it still existed. Once upon a time, before the island of Manhattan had any physical connection to the mainland, the Fulton Fish Market was the primary point of entry for nearly every piece of seafood New Yorkers ate. Clunky barges, flat-bottomed oyster skiffs, broad-beamed Hudson River sloops all made their way to this way station and docked at buildings that were inherently more geared toward the sea than to the land. There, all of this wild product was offloaded and transformed into forms the public would recognize as usable food for the larder. Oyster shuckers by the dozens queued up in the stretch that is now covered by the FDR Drive. Prehistoric-looking sturgeon, 5 feet long and armored with weird cartilaginous shields, were stacked like cordwood in the hulls of fishing boats from as far away as Kingston, and sold in pearly white chunks as Albany beef. Shad cutters, with the particular skill to convert an intrinsically grisly mess into a smooth, boneless fillet, worked in the early morning hours and laid out their product alongside the pinkish sacks of roe, smoked or raw depending on the taste of the client at hand. New York's fishing past is not as distant as one might think. As recently as 1929, an edition of the Fishing Gazette reported that 100